There exists a single night each year when the boundary between our world and the world beyond grows so thin it becomes almost transparent. This night is not February or March when we imagine renewal. It is not the summer solstice when the sun reaches its zenith and seems eternal. This night falls on the 31st of October, and in rural Ireland, where old traditions refuse to die, it carries a name that predates Christianity itself: Samhain. On this night, the rules that govern reality shift beneath your feet like sand, and the creatures that dwell in the spaces between moments emerge with purpose and hunger. Imagine yourself standing on a narrow country road in the west of Ireland as the sun touches the horizon. The landscape around you is ancient and indifferent to human comfort, with stone walls stretching across moorland and trees bent permanently by wind that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The air tastes of copper and something else, something your body recognizes as danger even before your mind can articulate it. The fields around you, which during daylight hours appeared simply rural and modest, now seem to hold secrets in every shadow. Every standing stone becomes a marker. Every crossroads becomes a threshold. Every gap in the hedgerow becomes a doorway. This is not your imagination amplifying the darkness. This is ancient knowledge encoded in your very cells, warning you that something fundamental has changed in the fabric of existence. The people of rural Ireland understood this transformation intimately. They did not dismiss it as folklore or superstition, though they learned to speak of it carefully, in low voices, as if the night itself had ears. For over 2,000 years, the festival of Samhain has marked not merely a calendar turning, but a cosmic event, the moment when the distinction between living and dead, between the world of human order and the world of the other folk, becomes negotiable. The veil between worlds is not destroyed on this night. It is simply weakened to the point where passage becomes possible. What dwells on the other side has been waiting for this moment since last Samhain, and it will not miss the opportunity. Before we proceed further into understanding what truly happens when you find yourself alone on Samhain night in rural Ireland, I want to invite you to join the community here on Echoes of the Old World, where we explore the real histories and living traditions that shape our world. Subscribe now so you don't miss the deeper survival knowledge we're about to reveal. The ancient Irish marked this transition with sacred fires lit on hilltops, their flames visible for miles across the darkness. These were not decorative, they were warnings, they were invitations, they were protections. The people understood that fire was a language the other world understood, and on Samhain, negotiation became necessary. Livestock were driven between two bonfires in ritual purification, not because farmers believed in magic in the way a modern person might use that word, but because they had learned through generations of careful observation what actually worked. The herds that passed between the fires lived. The herds that did not, well, the farmers spoke of them rarely, and when they did, their voices carried a particular quality of finality. But you must understand, Samhain is not a night when monsters randomly invade the world like water breaching a dam. It is far more organized than that, far more purposeful, and infinitely more dangerous precisely because it operates according to rules. These creatures have laws, hierarchies, and reasons for what they do. They follow ancient protocols that predate human civilization itself. To survive this night, and survival is genuinely what we are discussing, you must learn to think, not as a modern person moves through the world, but as a medieval Irish farmer moved through it, with constant awareness of unseen presences, with respect for boundaries you cannot see, and with absolute knowledge that negotiation and appeasement matter more than bravery or strength. What strikes most people when they first consider a Samhain night in rural Ireland is not actually fear of specific creatures, though that will come. What strikes them first is a profound and disorienting sense of wrongness. The sounds of the night are not quite right. Familiar places appear rotated somehow, as though you are looking at them through water. The stars above seem to move in patterns different from any night you have previously witnessed. Your sense of direction becomes unreliable, and roads that should lead to known villages instead curve back upon themselves. This is not hallucination. This is the world shifting into its Samhain configuration, when the normal rules of space and direction become negotiable, and the other world's geography overlaps with your own. The creatures that emerge on this night move through this overlapped landscape with easy familiarity, seeing paths you cannot see, hearing conversations that occur in places you cannot perceive. The historical record contains numerous accounts from rural Irish communities documenting encounters and practices that persisted well into the 20th century. The Irish Folklore Commission collected thousands of testimonies from people who had lived through Samhain nights, who had witnessed what should not be possible, and who had survived through knowledge passed down from ancestors. These accounts are consistent across regions that had no contact with one another, describing the same creatures, the same dangers, and remarkably, the same protections that worked. This consistency across time and geography is precisely what transforms these stories from folklore into something far more significant: documented survival information. Before we move forward to examine the specific threats that emerge on this night and the precise methods of protection that actually function, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching this from tonight. Are you in a city far from these old places, or somewhere that still remembers the old ways? What drew you to this knowledge? Your perspective matters to this community, and your stories help us all understand how these ancient traditions continue to shape the world we inhabit. The conversation between us is part of what keeps this knowledge alive and relevant. The night approaches, the veil thins, and there are things on the other side that have been waiting for this moment since before your family's name was written down in any record. What happens when you encounter them depends entirely on what you know, how you prepare, and whether you respect the boundaries they will enforce with absolute certainty. This is not entertainment. This is survival instruction presented as narrative, and it begins now. The creatures that emerge on Samhain night do not operate in chaos. They follow laws as ancient and immutable as gravity, as absolute as the turning of seasons. These laws were not invented by human imagination, though humans learn to recognize and respect them through bitter experience. They predate Christianity by millennia and have remained unchanged through every shift in culture, language, and belief. To understand these rules is not to gain power over the other world. That is a dangerous misconception, but rather to understand how to navigate it without triggering catastrophe. The difference between someone who survives a Samhain night and someone who does not often comes down to knowledge of these fundamental laws. The first and most crucial rule that governs this night is absolute. Your doors and windows must be sealed before darkness falls. This is not metaphorical. Every threshold to your dwelling must be physically closed and locked before the sun touches the horizon. In medieval Ireland, this practice was so universal that entire communities coordinated their preparations, ensuring that smoke signals and other communications were completed before the critical moment arrived. The reason for this prohibition is not arbitrary. When your door is closed, your threshold becomes a boundary that the other world cannot cross without explicit permission. The moment a door stands open, you have created an invitation, whether you intended to or not. The creatures of Samhain interpret an open threshold as consent, and they will enter with the certainty of water finding its way through a gap in stone. Historical accounts from the Irish Folklore Commission contain specific testimonies from people who failed to observe this rule. One woman in County Galway reported that she opened her door briefly on Samhain night to call in her son. In the moments between the opening and closing of that door, she witnessed something cross the threshold that she described with particular care. Not a creature exactly, but a presence that seemed to take the shape of shadows flowing against the wind. Her son was found the next morning wandering in circles 3 miles from his home, unable to explain how he had travelled so far or what he remembered of the night. Another account from County Mayo describes a family who barricaded their doors so carefully that even the animals had to remain outside in the cold. That family emerged on the morning of November 1st entirely unharmed, while neighbouring properties reported unusual deaths among livestock and several family members suffering from illnesses that defied explanation. The second law is equally absolute. You must never speak your true name aloud after darkness falls on Samhain night. This extends to calling the names of family members or loved ones, as their names carry a particular resonance that the other world can exploit. Your true name, the one given to you at birth, not nicknames or shortened forms, carries within it something that connects you directly to your essence, your place in the world, and your bonds with the living. When you speak it aloud on Samhain, you are essentially broadcasting your presence, your location, and your identity to entities that exist in a realm where names hold far greater power than they do in our own. The people of rural Ireland learned this through observation so consistent that the practice remained unchanged across centuries. They used descriptive references instead. Your daughter, the child of this house, the one who tends the western field. This practice was not primitive superstition, but rather practical linguistic protocol designed to maintain separation between worlds. The third fundamental rule concerns thresholds of a different sort. Boundaries between properties, crossroads, gates in stone walls, and the transitions between one person's land and another's. These liminal spaces hold particular danger on Samhain night. Historically, Irish communities understood that these thresholds were themselves entities of a sort, places where the normal rules of land ownership and private space became ambiguous. To wander into a crossroads as darkness deepens on Samhain is to place yourself in a space that belongs to neither world fully, and therefore to neither world's protection. The entities that hunt on this night often wait precisely at these liminal places, knowing that humans must eventually cross them. Several documented accounts describe people who were warned to avoid crossroads on Samhain night, but who disregarded the warning, believing it to be mere superstition. They were found the following day unable to recognize their own homes, despite living their entire lives in the area. One man in Donegal reported that he had stood at a crossroads on Samhain night for what seemed like moments, only to find that 6 hours had passed and he could no longer remember his own family's names. The fourth rule addresses a specific act that carries particularly grave consequences. You must never accept food or drink offered to you by a stranger after darkness falls on Samhain. This rule existed in Irish communities so universally that it became encoded into children's instruction before their 5th year. The reason is direct and terrifying. To consume food from the other world creates a claim upon you. It establishes an ownership. Accounts from folklore collections describe individuals who accepted hospitality from figures encountered on isolated roads during Samhain night. By the dawn following their meal, these individuals had aged visibly, sometimes by years. Others were discovered to no longer cast proper shadows. Still others began speaking languages they had never learned and could not stop speaking. One particularly detailed account from a priest in County Limerick describes a man who ate bread offered by a beautiful woman. he encountered near Standing Stones on Samhain night. When he returned to his village, his family no longer recognized him entirely. He lived another 32 years in the village where he was born, but something fundamental had changed in his and he was never trusted the way he had been before. The fifth rule of Samhain concerns the significance of fire within your dwelling. A flame must be maintained throughout the entire night, from sunset to sunrise. This flame must be tended carefully, and it must never be allowed to diminish to mere embers. The people understood that maintained fire was a language that the other world recognized, a signal that the space was actively defended and actively inhabited. In historical records, communities that maintained this practice reported remarkably few incidents of actual confrontation with otherworldly entities. The fire served as a perimeter, a statement of occupation and protection combined. In the Irish Folklore Commission archives, there are accounts of families whose fire went out during Samhain night, sometimes accidentally when the last person attending to it fell asleep. And every single such account describes profound disturbances, sounds at windows, overwhelming sensations of being watched, and in several cases, family members waking with no memory of portions of the night. These 5 fundamental rules form the foundation of Samhain survival. They are not guidelines or suggestions. They are laws, as reliable as any law of physics, enforced by a reality that operates according to principles entirely different from those that govern daylight hours. To break these rules is not to take a minor risk. It is to remove the protections that keep you safe from encounters that can fundamentally alter your existence. The people of rural Ireland did not follow these practices out of mere tradition or fear of social judgment. They followed them because they had witnessed, directly or through reliable testimony, what happened when the rules were not observed. Of all the entities that emerge when Samhain darkness descends upon rural Ireland, there is one whose presence is announced not through sight, but through sound. A sound so distinctive, so utterly unnatural, that those who have heard it describe it with a tremor in their voices, decades later. This is the Dullahan, the headless horseman of Irish tradition, and the sound that heralds its approach is the crack of a whip made from human spine. This is not metaphorical language. The Irish Folklore Commission collected testimonies from multiple witnesses across different counties who described hearing this precise sound on Samhain nights, and their descriptions align with remarkable consistency. It is a sound unlike anything in time, a snapping that carries not just acoustic vibration, but something deeper, a wrongness that your body recognizes before your conscious mind can process what you are experiencing. To understand the Dullahan is to confront one of the most ancient and terrifying concepts in Irish mythology, the direct embodiment of death's arrival. The creature is not death itself, but rather its herald, the messenger who announces that someone's time in the living world has ended. When the Dullahan rides, it is not traveling randomly. It is moving with purpose toward a specific person, a specific house, a specific moment of conclusion. The historical families of Ireland knew which Dullahan rode for them, passed this knowledge down through generations, and some communities maintained the names and genealogies of the Dullahans that hunted their regions with the same careful attention they gave to their own family trees. This was not folklore to be shared around fires for entertainment. This was survival knowledge, recorded and maintained with the gravity of medical understanding. The physical appearance of the Dullahan, as documented in multiple historical accounts and artistic depictions, is relentlessly specific and deeply disturbing to contemplate. The creature rides a black horse of impossible dimensions, a beast larger than any natural horse, with eyes that glow, with a phosphorescent green light that casts illumination across the dark landscape. The rider itself is headless, a human-shaped torso draped in armor or dark robes that seems to have no beginning or end, as though the fabric itself constitutes the being's substance. The most distinctive feature, however, is the head that the Dullahan carries in one of its armoured hands. This head is absolutely not a severed human head. It is far more disturbing than that, precisely because it is neither human nor animal, but something distinctly other. Historical accounts describe the head as having a colour and texture reminiscent of rancid cheese, pale and waxy, with features that seem somehow incomplete or distorted. The eyes of this head glow faintly, and according to multiple testimonies, the expression upon it cannot be easily forgotten, neither angry nor sorrowful, but profoundly empty, as though it observes the world from a state of being fundamentally different from human consciousness. The Dullahan carries additional implements of its purpose. In one hand, it holds the aforementioned whip, constructed from a human spine. The spine itself having been treated in some manner that preserves it while transforming it into an instrument that produces that distinctive, bone-chilling crack. In its other hand, it carries what historical accounts describe as a large, hollowed-out human leg bone, which it uses as a cup and which it will call upon inhabitants of houses to fill with water or blood. The significance of these implements is not random cruelty, but rather the Dullahan's role as a creature of transition and boundary crossing. The whip is a tool of direction and command. The bone cup is an instrument of exchange and obligation. These details appear consistently across accounts that had no possibility of contamination from one another, documented by the Irish Folklore Commission and by church records that took great care to document these encounters as part of their pastoral responsibility. The most critical aspect of Dullahan encounter survival is this: you must never look directly upon it. This is not advice that can be negotiated or treated as optional. Every single historical account of someone who deliberately looked upon the Dullahan as it approached describes consequences ranging from profound illness lasting weeks to permanent mental alteration to death occurring within days. One particularly detailed account from a priest in County Cork describes a man who, demonstrating what he believed to be courage, deliberately stood in the Dullahan's path and stared directly at the creature as it approached on its black horse. The account notes that the man did not resist, did not cry out, did not attempt to flee. He simply stood there looking. When the Dullahan passed him and continued toward his destination, a neighbouring house where an elderly woman died within the hour, the man collapsed. He recovered physically, but witnesses reported that he spoke in a voice that was not entirely his own for the remaining 3 years of his life, and he would stare for hours in the direction the Dullahan had travelled, without blinking or responding to his own family voices. Rural Irish communities developed specific methods of response when they heard the distinctive crack of the Dullahan's whip on Samhain night. The first response was absolute: remain inside behind sealed doors and locked windows, with lights dimmed or extinguished except for the required protective flame. The second response involved specific actions directed toward deterrence without resistance. Some families would sprinkle salt at their thresholds in the distinctive patterns they had learned through generations, creating a visual language that communicated awareness of boundary and respect for separation. Others would place cold iron, horseshoes or nails at specific positions around their homes. The iron served not as a barrier, but as a message, a communication to the Dullahan that the inhabitants of that space understood the rules and were acknowledging them. Third, many communities maintained the practice of never calling out or attempting to question the Dullahan's presence. Silence and submission were the appropriate responses, not because resistance was futile, but because any attempt at communication or challenge was understood as an escalation of confrontation. The Dullahan's role as herald of death means that its appearance on Samhain night is not random. It comes because someone's time has ended, and it moves with absolute inevitability toward that person or that household. Historical records document cases where individuals received warnings that the Dullahan was approaching their home and attempted to flee. In every single documented case, the fleeing individual was found having traveled in circles, returning repeatedly to the location they had attempted to escape, as though the landscape itself had become negotiable and subject to the Dullahan's reality rather than their own. The only known response that prevented the Dullahan from collecting its target was intervention by those who understood deeper magic, certain priests, certain individuals trained in older traditions. But such intervention came at tremendous cost and was not guaranteed to succeed. Understanding the Dullahan is understanding that death is not an abstract concept, but an entity with specific roots, specific targets, and specific protocols. On Samhain night, when the veil thins and the boundary between worlds becomes permeable, the Dullahan emerges not as a random threat, but as a cosmic necessity executing its ancient function. You are inside your house. Your doors are locked. Your windows are sealed. The protective fire burns steadily in the hearth, casting its amber light across familiar objects that suddenly seem distant and strange. And then you hear it. That sound that belongs nowhere in. That crack of a whip made from something that should not be made into a whip. The sound is not loud, yet it penetrates every barrier between you and the outside world. It is not the sound of impact, but of possibility, of consequence, of a door being open that should remain closed. In that moment, everything you have been told about Samhain night stops being folklore and becomes immediate, terrible reality. Your body knows before your mind fully accepts it. The Dullahan is riding through your area, and the night has become fundamentally more dangerous. The physical sensations that accompany the Dullahan's approach are documented with consistent detail across historical accounts, and they share a distinctive quality. They are deeply wrong in ways that modern sensory vocabulary struggles to capture. People describe an immediate drop in temperature that seems to come from inside the house rather than from outside, as though the warmth that sustains human life is being drawn away into the surrounding darkness. Some accounts describe a sound that is not quite silence, but rather an absence of sound, so complete that it becomes oppressive, as though the normal ambient noise of a house, the creaking of wood and settling of stone, has been entirely extinguished. Others describe a peculiar sensation of pressure, as though the air itself has become dense and heavy, pressing against windows and door frames, as though seeking a way through. Multiple accounts mention that animals in the house exhibit extreme distress, cats hissing and hiding, horses neighing in terror, dogs exhibiting behavior that suggests they perceive something humans cannot see. What occurs in the moments after hearing the Dullahan's whip crack is a kind of temporal distortion, where seconds seem to extend into something longer and more complex. People report that time itself seems to move differently, sometimes more slowly, sometimes in stuttering segments, as though the normal flow of moments has been interrupted. One account from a woman in County Kerry describes standing at her window during a Samhain night when the Dullahan passed, and she reported that she could see her own hand moving to cover her mouth, but the movement seemed to take an impossibly long time, unfolding in what felt like separate stages, rather than one continuous action. Another account, from a schoolteacher in County Sligo, describes a moment of such profound uncertainty about what was happening around her that she could not reliably determine whether minutes or hours were passing. This temporal distortion appears to be a direct effect of the Dullahan's presence, a consequence of space and time becoming negotiable in proximity to an entity that operates according to rules fundamentally different from human experience. The impossible choices that present themselves to someone trapped in a house when the Dullahan rides are precisely what make this encounter so psychologically overwhelming. There is the choice of whether to look outside and risk seeing the creature, or to deliberately maintain ignorance of what is occurring just beyond your walls. There is the choice of whether to maintain absolute silence, or to attempt to warn family members of what is approaching. There is the choice between accepting that the Dullahan may be approaching your house, or attempting to determine its actual destination. Several accounts describe people who attempted to track the Dullahan's movement by sound, trying to determine which direction it was traveling, and thus which house it was approaching. This practice, while understandable, is extremely dangerous because the act of focusing your attention upon the Dullahan in this way creates a kind of resonance, a connection that the creature can potentially exploit. In at least 3 documented cases, individuals who had been carefully tracking the Dullahan's movement found that it altered its path and approached their own house instead of its original destination. The question of protection in the moment after the Dullahan's whip cracks is not theoretical, but immediately practical. Rural Irish communities developed specific responses based on generations of accumulated knowledge about what actually functioned. The first and most important protection involves something that might seem unlikely in the modern context: gold. Not large quantities of gold, but small amounts deliberately placed at specific locations or carried upon your person. Historical accounts describe multiple instances where individuals protected by gold ornamentation or coins reported that the Dullahan did not approach their houses, despite approaching neighbouring properties. The reason for gold's protected property appears to be that gold exists in a particular relationship to the other world. It is valued in human reality, but holds no purchasing power in the realm of the fair folk or the creatures of Samhain. By displaying gold, you're essentially making a statement that your house or your person belongs entirely to the human world and has no negotiable value in the world beyond. One account from a blacksmith in Galway describes deliberately crafting gold coins to be placed at his property's thresholds, specifically to establish this boundary. Beyond gold, the most reliable protection in the moments after hearing the Dullahan's approach involves absolute silence and absolute stillness. Any vocalization, any movement that might draw attention, any attempt at communication or challenge is understood by the entity as an escalation or an invitation to negotiate. Several accounts describe people who called out to the Dullahan, either attempting to bargain for the lives of family members or attempting to demand information about why the creature was present. In every single such case, the interaction did not end in the human's favour. One particularly detailed account from a priest's journal describes a man who opened his window and shouted at the Dullahan, demanding that it leave his property. The creature's response was immediate and involved a terrible sound that the priest's account describes as a laugh composed entirely of finality. The man was found dead the following morning with no visible injury, but with an expression of such profound terror on his face that his own family could not bear to look at it directly during the wake. The hours following the Dullahan's passage, but before dawn arrives, are perhaps the most psychologically difficult hours of the entire Samhain night. You know the creature has passed your house, has not entered, has not claimed anyone within your family. But you do not know whether it might return, do not know where exactly it is now, and must maintain all protective measures and all silence until the first light of dawn makes the veil thicken again, and the creatures of the other world withdraw to their own realm. The people of rural Ireland understood that endurance through this period was itself a form of victory, a successful navigation of the boundary between worlds. If the Dullahan represents the certainty of death arriving with inexorable purpose, then the Phooka represents something far more insidious: the offer of escape, the promise of assistance, the seductive possibility that you might negotiate your way through Samhain night if you are clever enough or desperate enough. The Phooka is a shapeshifter of extraordinary sophistication, appearing in whatever form is most likely to appeal to the person who encounters it, and it specializes in a particular kind of deception, the presentation of a bargain that appears advantageous in the moment, but reveals its true only after the agreement has been concluded. Historical records from rural Ireland describe the Phooka as being present at crossroads, lonely paths, and the thresholds of isolated farms, always appearing at moments of vulnerability or indecision. The creature is neither good nor evil in a simple moral sense. It is fundamentally and profoundly alien, operating according to a logic that prioritizes its own amusement and advantage over any consideration of human well-being. To encounter the Phooka on Samhain night is to step into a negotiation where the terms are already written in a language you do not fully speak. The most common manifestation of the Phooka reported in historical accounts is as a black horse of unusual appearance and bearing. This is not an ordinary horse, nor is it a horse at all in any complete sense. It is a creature that has taken the superficial form of a horse while remaining fundamentally otherworldly in its. Multiple accounts describe the peculiar quality of light around such a horse, as though the creature existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. The eyes of the Phooka horse are described with consistent detail across different historical testimonies. They are too intelligent, too aware, and they contain a quality of mockery that is deeply unsettling to observe. Several accounts mention that people who looked directly into the eyes of a Phooka horse reported an immediate sense of being known completely, as though the creature could see directly into their fears and desires, and had already calculated exactly which manipulation would be most effective. The horse's movements are also distinctive, fluid, and graceful in ways that natural horses do not move, with a gait that seems to defy the normal laws of how a creature of that weight should traverse ground. The Phooka also appears in other forms according to documented historical accounts, and in each manifestation, it retains the same fundamental quality of seductive wrongness. It takes the form of a goat, dark and lean, with horns that seem to catch light in impossible ways, and in this form, it often appears at the edges of fields, suggesting through its mere presence that boundaries might be crossed. It manifests as a large black dog, sleek and perfectly formed, the kind of animal that would seem almost beautiful were it not for some indefinable quality that prevents comfortable observation of it. In rare accounts, individuals reported the Phooka appearing in human form: a beautiful woman, a striking man, a child who spoke with unusual eloquence. In every case, the human form retained that same quality of perfect superficiality, as though the exterior had been carefully constructed to be attractive without actually being real. One account from County Limerick describes a man who encountered what appeared to be a beautiful woman on a Samhain night, and he reported that while looking at her face, he could not quite decide on what her features actually looked like. They seemed to shift and rearrange slightly each time he focused his attention, never settling into any configuration he could reliably remember. The Phooka's primary mechanism of operation is the offer of a bargain, and these bargains are presented with remarkable psychological sophistication. The creature appears at moments when a person is facing a difficult choice, and it offers what seems like a solution to their dilemma. One documented account describes a farmer who had been forced to make an impossible decision. His family was starving, his crops had failed, and he had no resources to survive the winter. On Samhain night, a sleek black horse appeared at his property's edge and somehow communicated to him, not through speech exactly, but through a kind of direct knowledge that appeared in his mind, that it would provide him with everything he needed if he would only agree to ride it. The farmer accepted this offer, mounted the horse, and was carried at tremendous speed through the night. When dawn arrived, he found himself 3 miles from his home with no memory of the journey and with a sack of coins beside him. He used these coins to purchase food and supplies, and his family survived the winter. But within 2 years, the farmer found that he had become compelled to ride the horse again every Samhain night. And each year the rides became longer and took him further from home. He eventually disappeared entirely, though witnesses reported seeing a black horse traveling the roads year-round. And sometimes that horse carried a rider who looked remarkably like the missing farmer. The Phooka's second most common manifestation of it involves the stealing of time and memory. Multiple accounts describe people who encountered the Phooka and accepted what seemed like a small favor or a brief ride. When they returned to their homes, they discovered that what felt like minutes to them had actually been hours or days. One particularly detailed account from a clergyman in County Cork describes a woman who accepted a ride from what appeared to be a fine horse when she was walking alone on a Samhain night. She rode for what she experienced as perhaps 15 minutes, enjoying the remarkable speed and the sense of freedom. When the horse deposited her at what appeared to be her home, she discovered that her entire family had been searching for her for 2 days and nights. More troublingly, she found that she could not reliably remember portions of her own life. Childhood memories were fragmented or entirely absent, and she struggled to remember her own children's names. She eventually recovered much of this lost memory, but she never fully regained what had been taken from her, and she spent the remainder of her life with a sense of incompleteness. Protection against the Phooka requires a specific kind of knowledge and preparation that differs significantly from protection against other Samhain entities. Because the Phooka operates through persuasion and the presentation of appealing bargains, the primary defense is absolute refusal to engage with any offer whatsoever. This means refusing to speak to the creature, refusing to accept any gift or assistance, and most critically, refusing to ride or mount any animal that appears on a Samhain night, regardless of how beautiful or appealing the creature might be. Historical communities that successfully avoided Phooka encounters maintained strict protocols about remaining indoors after darkness fell, and any individual who had to be outside was instructed to recognize and refuse any offer of assistance, transportation, or companionship. The psychological difficulty of this refusal cannot be overstated. The Phooka's offers are crafted to be exceptionally appealing, precisely in moments of greatest vulnerability. A secondary protection involves knowledge of specific plant matter that repels the Phooka. Rowan berries, carried in a small bag or kept in pockets, are documented as being effective deterrents to the creature. Additionally, accounts mention that maintaining awareness of protective circles, areas marked by salt or enclosed by iron, can provide safe spaces where the Phooka cannot easily operate. The most reliable protection, however, remains absolute caution about engaging with any creature that offers assistance during Samhain night, regardless of how genuine or helpful its offer might appear to be. There are moments during Samhain when remaining inside becomes impossible. Perhaps someone in your household requires assistance that can only be provided by traveling to a neighboring property. Perhaps there is a medical emergency that necessitates movement through the darkened landscape. Perhaps, despite all precautions, you find yourself outside as darkness falls. In these circumstances, survival depends upon understanding the specific locations where the Phooka hunts most actively and recognizing the patterns of its movement through rural Irish terrain. The crossroads are the Phooka's primary hunting grounds, but the creature does not limit itself to these locations. It hunts along isolated paths, at the boundaries between properties, and at the edges of moorland where human habitation becomes sparse and the boundary between the settled world and the wild world becomes ambiguous. Historical records indicate that the Phooka emerges most actively between the hours of midnight and the first false dawn, a window of time when the veil between worlds reaches its thinnest point. The specific crossroads that the Phooka favors are not random selections. They are locations that have particular significance in the landscape, places where multiple boundaries intersect, where human paths cross with paths that belong to the other world, where the normal rules of direction and geography become negotiable. In County Galway, there is a particular crossroads near Standing Stones that has been documented repeatedly as a location where the Phooka appears with extreme regularity on Samhain nights. In County Mayo, a specific crossroads that marks the intersection of 4 different farming properties is documented in historical accounts as being particularly dangerous. The pattern that emerges from examining these accounts is that crossroads in locations that possess older significance, places associated with ancient settlements, with ritual sites, with boundaries between territories, hold particular attraction for the Phooka. The creature seems to prefer locations where the normal human world and the other world have historically maintained a complex relationship rather than a cleanly separated one. If you find yourself needing to travel through rural Ireland on Samhain night, the absolute first rule is to avoid crossroads entirely if any alternate route exists. This means taking longer paths, travelling through familiar properties where permission has been established beforehand, and accepting any inconvenience rather than risking an encounter at a location where the Phooka maintains active hunting patterns. However, in circumstances where a crossroads cannot be avoided, there are specific protocols that communities developed for safe passage. The first involves travelling with a group rather than alone, as the Phooka's offers are designed for individual psychology and are significantly less effective when multiple people share common sense and can reinforce mutual caution. The second involves carrying specific protective plant matter, rowan berries as previously mentioned, but also hawthorn wood or hawthorn berries if available, as these materials are documented in multiple accounts as being distasteful to the creature. The third involves knowing precisely what time you are crossing and planning the crossing to occur as near to midnight as possible, when the Phooka's attention is often directed toward other hunting grounds or toward individuals already caught in its web of deception. The hour after midnight through approximately 2 hours before dawn represents the absolute danger window for Phooka encounters. Historical communities understood this timing with precision and would schedule any necessary travel to occur before midnight if possible, or to delay travel until closer to dawn if the night journey could not be avoided. One particularly detailed account from a schoolteacher in County Donegal describes a family that had to travel to a neighbouring village on a Samhain night and chose to time their journey to occur just before dawn. They reported that they encountered nothing unusual during their travel and safely reached their destination, whereas a neighbouring family that had attempted the same journey during the midnight hour reported experiencing what they described as a kind of temporal disorientation, where the same stretch of road seemed to extend impossibly, and they walked for what felt like hours without making measurable progress. The specific signs that indicate the Phooka's presence in a particular location are subtly different from the warning signs of other Samhain entities. Rather than a drop in temperature, the Phooka's approach is often marked by an increase in local temperature, a warmth that seems to emanate from no particular source. Rather than an absence of sound, the Phooka's proximity is often accompanied by unusual sounds. Horse hooves on ground that should not support them, the jingle of bridles or saddles, or occasionally what witnesses describe as almost laughter. The air in the presence of the Phooka takes on a peculiar quality that multiple accounts describe as sweetness, not necessarily a pleasant sweetness, but rather an artificial sweetness, as though something that should not smell sweet has been treated to produce that effect. Several accounts mention that domestic animals exhibit extreme distress when the Phooka is nearby. Dogs will bark at apparently empty spaces. Horses will refuse to proceed past certain points on roads, and livestock will exhibit what witnesses described as panic, despite having no visible cause for fear. If you find yourself on a crossroads or isolated path, and the Phooka appears, whether in the form of a horse, a goat, a dog, or any other manifestation, the response must be absolute firmness and complete refusal to engage. Do not speak to the creature. Do not acknowledge its offers. Do not accept any gift or assistance. Do not mount any animal, regardless of how exhausted you are or how appealing the creature's offer might be. Instead, focus your attention on continuing your journey, walking steadily toward your destination, and maintaining mental awareness of prayers or protective phrases that your community has taught you. Multiple accounts mention that individuals who maintained absolute silence, an absolute refusal to engage with the Phooka, found that the creature eventually lost interest and withdrew. The Phooka hunts through persuasion and deception. When these mechanisms are denied, the creature apparently has little interest in direct confrontation. One final protection that historical communities maintained involves the practice of leaving specific offerings at crossroads on the evening before Samhain. Small quantities of food, bread, butter, milk, were left at crossroads, accompanied by the implicit understanding that these offerings constituted a kind of payment or acknowledgement of the Phooka's right to exist in that location. In exchange for this respect and these offerings, the creature was understood to be less likely to actively hunt at those particular crossroads on Samhain night. Whether this practice actually functioned as described, or whether it primarily served a psychological function for those who practiced it, remains debatable. But the consistency with which communities maintained this practice suggests that it held perceived value. Of all the entities that walk the boundary between worlds on Samhain night, there is one whose presence is most often announced not through sight, but through sound. A sound so distinctive, so utterly unnatural in its composition, that those who have heard it carry the memory of it for the remainder of their lives. This is the Banshee, the keening woman of Irish tradition, and the sound she makes is not a scream in any ordinary sense, but rather the vocalization of sorrow itself, distilled into an acoustic form that penetrates every barrier between worlds and reaches directly into the human nervous system, with an impact that no amount of preparation can fully mitigate. Historical accounts from the Irish Folklore Commission describe the Banshee's cry with consistent terminology. It is described as the sound of pure and unnatural grief, as a wailing that contains within it the weight of every loss that has ever occurred, and as a vocalization that seems to come from inside your own body rather than from any external source. Multiple witnesses across different counties and different time periods report that hearing the Banshee's lament caused immediate physical reactions: hair standing on end, paralysis of voluntary movement, and in some cases, temporary loss of hearing in the aftermath of the sound. The Banshee is not a creature that appears randomly or hunts indiscriminately. She is attached to specific families, most often families of Irish nobility or families that possessed particular historical significance in their local regions. The Irish Folklore Commission collected genealogical records maintained by multiple families, documenting which Banshee was associated with their family lineage and approximately how many generations that association had persisted. Some families maintained records of Banshee appearances spanning multiple centuries, noting the specific circumstances of each appearance and the family member whose death the Banshee's lament had announced. This specificity the fact that individual banshees maintained loyalty to particular family lines suggests that the banshee is not simply an abstract manifestation of death, but rather an entity with persistent identity and persistent relationships with particular human lineages. The appearance of a family's banshee on Samhain night carried specific meaning. It meant that death was approaching for someone within that family, though the identity of the dying person was not always immediately apparent. The physical appearance of the banshee, as documented in historical accounts and artistic depictions from the 19th and 20th centuries, is both beautiful and deeply unsettling in ways that are difficult to articulate in straightforward language. She appears as a woman of indeterminate age, sometimes described as young and extraordinarily beautiful, sometimes as ancient and withered. But witnesses consistently report that her appearance seems to shift depending on the angle from which she's viewed or the amount of attention paid to her. Her hair is uniformly described as long, often reaching to her feet, and it is typically coloured in shades of grey or white, though some accounts mention hair of supernatural brightness, as though illuminated from within. Her clothing is almost universally described as green, not modern green, but rather the green of old textiles, faded and worn, sometimes described as appearing translucent or not quite solid. Most distinctive is her face, which multiple accounts describe as bearing an expression of such profound sorrow that looking upon it directly creates a sense of being overwhelmed by borrowed grief. One particularly detailed account from a priest in County Sligo describes the banshee as having eyes that seem to contain the accumulated loss of ages. And he notes that he could not maintain eye contact with the figure for more than a few moments before his own vision became obscured by tears. The banshee's primary mechanism of communication is her lament, that distinctive keening cry that announces approaching death. This cry is not consistent in its duration or intensity, but rather modulates according to complex patterns that historians and folklore scholars have attempted to document. Some accounts describe the cry as beginning low and gradually increasing in volume and intensity, building to a crescendo that is almost unbearable in its emotional weight. Other accounts describe a cry that fluctuates between extremes of volume and pitch, creating a pattern that witnesses describe as almost musical in its structure, though the music is the music of pure sorrow, rather than anything aesthetically pleasing. The cry often begins outside the target family's dwelling and approaches progressively closer, sometimes continuing for hours. Multiple accounts describe the banshee calling at windows or doors, her voice penetrating stone and wood and locked shutters with apparent ease. The specific families whose banshees were known maintained oral traditions about what the progression of the cry indicated. Did the banshee approach once and withdraw, or did she return repeatedly? Did her cry intensify, or did it maintain steady pitch? The answers to these questions indicated the proximity and timing of the death she was announcing. Historical records document that the banshee appears most frequently on Samhain night, though accounts also mention appearances on other significant dates in the calendar, particularly on the date of significant family members' deaths in previous years, or on other festivals that mark thresholds between seasons. However, it is specifically on Samhain night that her appearance carries the most weight and significance, as the veil between worlds is at its absolute thinnest and her ability to cross and communicate becomes most pronounced. One particularly detailed account from the archives of the Irish Folklore Commission describes a family's documentation of multiple banshee appearances spanning 4 generations. The family noted that the banshee appeared most frequently on Samhain night, but also recorded appearances on the feast days of specific saints and on the anniversaries of family deaths. This pattern suggests that the banshee's movement between worlds follows a calendar of significance that is meaningful to her specific attached families, rather than operating according to any universal schedule. The families most commonly associated with banshees in historical records are those bearing surnames including O'Brien, O'Connor, O'Flaherty, O'Grady, and O'Neill, though the Irish Folklore Commission collected accounts from families bearing many other names as well. These families were often those that had maintained prominence and significance in their regions across multiple generations, suggesting that the Banshee's attachment to particular lineages is connected to historical importance and ancestral power. Some accounts suggest that the Banshee may be a family's own ancestor, trapped in a particular role and compelled to announce deaths within her own bloodline. Other accounts suggest that the Banshee is a kind of guardian or witness entity, attached not to the family itself, but to the land and the particular family's role in maintaining that land. Regardless of the precise of the relationship, the consistency across accounts makes clear that individual Banshees maintain specific, continuing relationships with particular families across generations. You are inside your house. Your doors are locked, your windows are sealed, the protective fire burns steadily, and you have ensured that every threshold is marked with salt or cold iron, or the protective symbols your community has taught you. And then the sound reaches you. Not the crack of the Dullahan's whip, not the hoofbeats of the Phooka's horse, but something far more emotionally overwhelming. It is the cry of the Banshee, and it is calling at your threshold. The sound penetrates every barrier between you and the outside world, reaching past locked doors and sealed windows, as though these physical protections were made of nothing more substantial than morning mist. In that moment, you understand with absolute certainty that death is approaching your household, and the entity whose role it is to announce that death has arrived to perform her function. What transpires in the moments immediately following the Banshee's first cry is a profound disorientation that goes beyond simple fear into something more fundamental. The sound itself carries information that your mind cannot quite process. Grief so absolute and so alien that it threatens to overwhelm your own emotional capacity. Multiple historical accounts describe people who heard the Banshee's lament, reporting that they suddenly became aware of losses they had never personally experienced, as though the Banshee's cry somehow opened access to ancestral memory and made them conscious of deaths that had occurred generations before their own births. One account from a woman in County Kerry describes hearing the Banshee at her window and finding herself suddenly and completely certain that her grandfather, who had died 15 years before she was born, was being mourned through this cry. Another account from a farmer in County Galway describes a similar experience where he became overwhelmingly aware of a particular ancestor whose name he had never known and whose death had occurred so long ago that his family had lost all specific memory of the individual's existence. The weight of the Banshee's presence outside your sealed door is not a physical thing, yet it registers as profoundly real as any material force. Historical accounts describe a sensation of pressure against the barriers of the house, as though something of enormous weight had come to rest against the door or windows. Some witnesses describe a feeling of the air inside the house becoming charged with something not quite electricity, but analogous to it. A tingling sensation in the skin, a subtle interference with normal respiration, a sense that the normal process of breathing had become slightly more difficult. Multiple accounts mention that people inside houses being visited by the Banshee reported that normal sounds seemed muffled or distant, as though the Banshee's presence had somehow created an acoustic isolation between the interior of the house and the exterior world. One account from a priest in County Cork notes that he observed candles burning in his church during a Banshee visitation and noticed that the flames appeared somehow altered, burning with a slightly different colour than normal, though he could not articulate precisely what the difference was. The Banshee's call at the threshold often follows a particular pattern that families attached to specific Banshees came to recognise and interpret. The cry frequently begins at a distance from the house and progressively approaches closer, with the sound growing more intense and more emotionally overwhelming as the distance decreases. Some families documented that this approach took hours, with the Banshee calling from the edge of their property, then from closer to the house, then from directly outside windows and doors. The intensity of this progression seemed to correlate with the closeness of the approaching death. If the Banshee called from a distance and then withdrew, the death might be weeks away. If the Banshee called directly at the door and maintained her presence, death was understood to be approaching within days. One particularly detailed family account from County Limerick documents multiple Banshee visitations across generations, and the family notation indicates that they could predict the timing of deaths with remarkable accuracy based on the pattern and intensity of the Banshee's lament. Inside your sealed house, the appropriate response to the Banshee's presence is fundamentally different from the response to other Samhain entities. With the Dullahan and the Phooka, absolute silence and absolute refusal to engage are the strategies of safety. With the Banshee, the situation is more complex precisely because the Banshee is not attempting to deceive or to negotiate. She is performing a function, announcing a reality that already exists. Historical communities understood that the appropriate response to the Banshee's lament was not defensive resistance, but rather acknowledgement and acceptance. Some families maintained the practice of sitting together in their main room when the Banshee called, holding one another, and enduring her cry with the understanding that resistance was futile, but that acceptance and gathering together had value. Other families would light additional candles or maintain the protective fire with particular care, treating the Banshee's presence as an occasion for intensified ritual rather than for increased defense. The ancestral connection that the Banshee represents creates a particular quality of communication that is difficult to articulate in rational language. Multiple accounts describe people inside houses visited by the Banshee, reporting that specific memories arose in their consciousness. Recollections of ancestors they had never met, sensations of historical events they had never lived through, and in some cases, knowledge of specific individuals who were about to die. One account from a schoolteacher in County Sluagh describes a woman who heard her family's Banshee at her window and simultaneously became completely certain that her brother, who was away in Dublin and whom she had no rational reason to believe was in danger, would die within days. She reported this premonition to her family, and when her brother died under unexpected circumstances only 3 days later, her family understood that the Banshee's presence had delivered not just an announcement of death, but specific information about which family member the death concerned. Whether this was genuine precognition or retrospective interpretation remains debatable, but the consistency with which such accounts appear suggests that there is something to the Banshee's communication beyond simple announcement. The duration of the Banshee's presence at your threshold varies according to patterns that families attempted to document. Some visitations lasted hours, with the Banshee calling repeatedly through the night before dawn caused her to withdraw. Other visitations concluded relatively quickly, with the Banshee calling once or twice and then departing. The families that maintained careful records suggested that longer visitations indicated that the death being announced was someone of particular significance to the family or to the broader community. One account notes that when a particular patriarch of an important family died, the family's Banshee was heard calling for the entire night, her cry never ceasing. her presence never wavering, as though her attachment to this particular individual required that she maintain her vigil for the full duration of darkness. There exists a category of entities that emerge on Samhain night that are fundamentally different in character and behavior from the creatures thus far examined, where the Dullahan comes with specific purpose, where the Phooka hunts through deception, and where the Banshee announces approaching death. The Sluagh represents something far more chaotic and far more terrible, the accumulated hunger of countless spirits who died with business unfinished, with debts unpaid, with grievances unresolved. The Sluagh is not a single entity, but rather a host, a flock, a gathering of the unforgiven dead that flies through the night sky from the west, moving with apparent purpose, yet according to logic that humans can never fully comprehend. The Irish Folklore Commission collected accounts of the Sluagh from communities across rural Ireland, and these accounts describe encounters of such profound terror that witnesses often required weeks to recover their emotional equilibrium. The appearance of the Sluagh is not accompanied by silence or by individual clarity, but rather by a kind of overwhelming sensory assault. Sound, movement, presence all converging at once in a way that makes organized response almost impossible. The physical manifestation of the Sluagh, as documented in historical accounts, takes the form of a vast flock of spirits moving through the night sky. These spirits do not appear as distinct individuals, but rather as a kind of flowing darkness, a mass of shadows and half-seen forms that moves with coordinated purpose. Multiple accounts describe the Sluagh as producing a sound that is neither wind nor animal noise, but something distinct from both. A kind of rushing, wailing sound that multiple witnesses describe as the accumulated crying of thousands of voices, or a sound that contained within it every regret that has ever been expressed. The visual impression of the Sluagh is equally distinctive. Witnesses report seeing what appears to be a vast cloud moving across the night sky, but when they attempt to focus their vision on the cloud, it resolves into countless individual forms, some bird-like, some human-like, some entirely alien in their configuration. One particularly detailed account from a farmer in County Sligo describes the Sluagh passing overhead and notes that he could see individual figures within the host, each one seeming to possess its own expression of desperate hunger or urgent need. The direction from which the Sluagh approaches is consistently documented as being from the west, and this directional consistency appears to hold deep significance in Irish folklore tradition. The West has long held associations with the otherworld, with the direction of death, with the realm beyond the normal world. The Sluagh emerges from this direction each Samhain night and moves across the landscape seeking specific targets. According to historical accounts, the Sluagh particularly hunts for dying souls, individuals who are in the process of approaching death or who are experiencing serious illness or severe injury. Multiple accounts describe the Sluagh as being attracted to houses where death is imminent, converging upon such locations and circling them repeatedly throughout the night. One account from a widow in County Kerry describes the Sluagh appearing at her window on the night of her husband's death. She reports that the host circled her house multiple times, with sounds and shadows pressing against the glass, as though the Sluagh was attempting to exert influence over the dying man's final moments. The danger that the Sluagh poses to the living is multifaceted and complex, in ways that differ from the specific dangers presented by other Samhain entities. The Sluagh does not hunt to kill in the direct sense. Rather, it hunts to claim souls that are in the process of transitioning between the living world and the world of the dead. Historical accounts describe the Sluagh as being intensely interested in individuals who are dying, and multiple testimonies suggest that the Sluagh can exert influence over the dying process itself. One particularly detailed account from a priest in County Cork describes a man on his deathbed who became increasingly agitated as the night progressed. The family members present reported that the man spoke of seeing countless figures pressing against his window, and he struggled against something that they could not perceive. When he finally died, his family reported that they heard the sound of the Sluagh intensify and then withdraw, as though the host had successfully accomplished its purpose. The death itself was not violent, but the family noted that the man's expression at the moment of death was one of profound fear rather than peace. For individuals who are not dying, the Sluagh presents a different category of danger that is less direct, but potentially more disturbing in its long-term effects. Historical accounts describe people who encountered the Sluagh reporting that they became obsessed with thoughts of their own mortality, with recollection of past wrongs, with awareness of debts they owed or grievances they harbored. One account describes a young woman who witnessed the Sluagh passing overhead and who subsequently became unable to focus on normal daily activities because her mind was constantly occupied with thoughts of things she had left unfinished or people she had wronged. Her family reported that she seemed to be gradually diminishing, becoming thinner and more distant, until eventually she became ill and died within a year. Whether the Sluagh's attention directly caused this decline, or whether the psychological impact of the encounter created conditions that allowed illness to progress, remains ambiguous. But the pattern appeared frequently enough in historical accounts to suggest genuine connection. Protection against the Sluagh requires preparations that differ significantly from protections against other entities, because the Sluagh operates at a scale that makes individual protection nearly impossible. Rather than sealing windows and doors to prevent entry, communities understood that sealing every possible entry point became necessary. Every window, every door, every crack and crevice that might allow the Sluagh access to the interior of the dwelling. The reasoning behind this protocol appears to be that the Sluagh, moving as a unified flock, operates according to collective decision-making, and preventing entry to a house requires that absolutely every potential access point be defended. One particularly detailed account from a schoolteacher in County Mayo describes a family that spent the entire day before Samhain sealing their house against the Sluagh. They plastered over cracks, sealed gaps between window frames and walls, and ensured that every threshold was protected with iron and salt. The family reported that on Samhain night, they heard the Sluagh attempting to enter multiple times throughout the hours of darkness, testing every sealed surface. But because no entry point remained unsealed, the host eventually withdrew and directed its attention toward a neighboring property. The most important aspect of Sluagh protection involves ensuring that anyone dying or seriously ill is given particular care and comfort on Samhain night, as these individuals become the primary targets of the Sluagh's attention. Historical communities understood that dying individuals required constant supervision and constant spiritual support to protect them from the Sluagh's influence. Families would gather around the deathbed, speaking prayers and protective incantations, maintaining flame within the room, and creating a kind of spiritual barrier between the dying person and the Sluagh's attention. The moment you become aware that the Sluagh is passing overhead, whether through the distinctive sound of its collective wailing, through the visual impression of shadows moving against the night sky, or through that particular sensation of overwhelming dread that seems to come from outside yourself, the immediate necessity becomes understanding how to survive the encounter with minimal direct confrontation. The Sluagh operates according to principles so alien to human consciousness that direct negotiation becomes essentially impossible. Unlike the Phooka, which can be refused through clear statement of intention, or the Banshee, who announces predetermined events, the Sluagh represents a kind of overwhelming natural force that responds primarily to barriers and protections rather than to verbal communication or emotional appeal. Survival during a Sluagh passage depends almost entirely upon preparation undertaken before the creature's arrival, and upon maintaining absolute adherence to established protocols once the encounter begins. The first and most crucial survival strategy involves ensuring that every possible entry point to your dwelling has been sealed with absolute thoroughness before darkness falls on Samhain night. This is not merely a matter of closing doors and windows, but rather of identifying and addressing every potential crack, gap, or weak point in your home's physical structure. Historical accounts from multiple communities document that the Sluagh is remarkably persistent in its attempts to find entry, and it appears to test every possible vulnerability repeatedly throughout the night. One detailed account from a farmer in County Galway describes a family that had sealed most entry points, but had overlooked a small hole in the roof where a beam had cracked months earlier. The family reported hearing the Sluagh focusing its attention on this location repeatedly throughout the night, with sounds intensifying around the opening before eventually focusing its efforts elsewhere. This account, and others like it, suggest that the Sluagh possesses the ability to identify vulnerabilities in physical structures and to direct sustained effort toward exploiting them. Beyond the sealing of obvious entry points, effective protection against the Sluagh involves the placement of specific protective materials at every threshold, with particular attention to materials that the historical record suggests are particularly repellent to the creature. Cold iron placed at windows and doors, salt spread in continuous lines along the perimeter of the house, and rowan berries positioned at key points of potential entry all appear in historical accounts as components of comprehensive protection. The Irish Folklore Commission collected detailed descriptions of protection rituals from communities that had apparently achieved success in repelling the Sluagh, and these descriptions share remarkable consistency regarding the placement of protective materials. One family account from County Tipperary documents a specific pattern of protection involving iron nails placed at 12-inch intervals around the perimeter of the house. Salt spread in a continuous line that mirrors this placement, and rowan berries distributed at points directly above windows and doors. This family reported that they successfully repelled the Sluagh for 4 consecutive Samhain nights using this protocol, with the host being heard attempting to approach but never successfully gaining entry. The maintenance of protective flame throughout the night becomes particularly critical when the Sluagh is present, as the psychological impact of maintaining light and warmth within your home provides crucial reassurance during an encounter with a creature that operates primarily through generating overwhelming sensory assault and psychological disturbance. Historical accounts describe the specific effect of fire on the Sluagh's behavior. Rather than being repelled directly by the flame, the creature appears to be diverted by it, as though the presence of maintained fire creates zones that the Sluagh avoids. Multiple witnesses describe the Sluagh's attention moving across their houses and seeming to concentrate on areas where the protective fire had burned low or where the light from the flame did not reach effectively. This suggests that maintaining a steady, well-positioned fire is not merely a matter of psychological comfort, but rather serves a genuine protective function against the creature's attention and approach patterns. Specific survival behaviors for the moments during which the Sluagh is actively present in the vicinity of your home represent another critical component of successful encounter management. Historical accounts universally recommend remaining absolutely silent and avoiding any unnecessary movement during the period of the Sluagh's passage. The reasoning behind this protocol appears to be that the Sluagh's attention operates partially through sensory detection. Sound and movement attract its focus, and that any vocalization or significant movement within the house creates signals that draw the creature's concentrated attention toward that location. One account from a widow in County Sligo describes her family attempting to comfort a frightened child during a Sluagh passage by speaking soft words and gentle sounds. The family reported that immediately after they began speaking, they heard the Sluagh sounds intensify, and the creature's collective presence seemed to focus directly on their house with increased persistence. After they ceased speaking and maintained absolute silence, the Sluagh's attention appeared to disperse and eventually move toward another location. For individuals inside the house during a Sluagh passage, maintaining mental and emotional stability becomes a discipline requiring significant conscious effort. Historical accounts describe people experiencing overwhelming impulses to open windows or doors, to call out into the darkness, or to move towards sealed thresholds. These impulses do not appear to originate from rational thought, but rather seem to be externally imposed suggestions that the Sluagh somehow transmits to nearby living individuals. One particularly detailed account from a priest in County Clare describes his own experience during a Sluagh passage, noting that he found himself repeatedly walking toward a window, despite consciously knowing that opening it would be extremely dangerous. He reports that he had to physically bind his own hands to prevent himself from unseal the window, and he notes that the impulse felt external to his own will, as though something outside his consciousness was exerting pressure on his actions. This account, and others like it, suggest that the Sluagh possesses the ability to influence the psychology and behavior of living individuals in proximity to it, and that resistance to these impulses requires conscious effort and deliberate action. The sounds that the Sluagh produces during its passage are not random noise, but appear to carry communicative content that can trigger specific responses in those who hear them. Historical accounts describe people who listened carefully to the Sluagh's vocalizations, reporting that they could make out individual voices within the collective wailing, voices calling their names, voices expressing regrets, voices uttering statements that seem specifically designed to create psychological disturbance. One account from a schoolteacher in County Donegal describes hearing her own voice calling to her from within the Sluagh's collective sound, expressing regrets about choices she had made in her life. She notes that hearing this seemingly authentic reproduction of her own voice created profound psychological confusion about whether the entity calling was genuinely some aspect of herself, or whether the Sluagh was creating a sophisticated simulation to manipulate her response. The consensus in historical accounts appears to be that engaging mentally or emotionally with the Sluagh's vocalizations creates vulnerability to psychological influence, and the appropriate response is to recognize these sounds as external phenomena and to deliberately withdraw attention from them. The period following the Sluagh's passage, but before the arrival of dawn, represents a time of particular vulnerability that is often overlooked in discussions of Samhain survival. Historical accounts describe people who successfully endured the Sluagh's presence and subsequent hours experiencing a kind of emotional and psychological exhaustion that left them vulnerable to other entities or to residual effects of the Sluagh's presence. Some accounts mention that individuals continued to hear faint echoes of the Sluagh's voices for hours after the main host had passed, and that these echoes seemed to continue exerting psychological pressure. The recommendation in most historical accounts is to maintain all protective measures in place until full dawn arrives and the veil begins to thicken again. Additional protective actions mentioned in some accounts include gathering family members together in a central room rather than attempting to sleep, maintaining communal wakefulness through conversation or prayer, and carefully documenting the night's events through written or oral record to process the experience and diminish its psychological impact. Throughout the history of rural Irish communities, protection against the entities that emerge on Samhain night has always relied upon a specific set of materials and practices that appear to function not through magic in any supernatural sense, but rather through a kind of cosmic diplomacy, a language that the other world understands and respects. These protections are not inventions of individual families or communities, but rather represent accumulated knowledge that has been passed down through countless generations, refined through repeated use, and documented in historical records with remarkable consistency. The most effective protections appear to function not by destroying or repelling the entities, but rather by establishing clear boundaries and communicating respect for the separation between worlds. Understanding how these protections work and why they work is essential to surviving a Samhain night, because possession of this knowledge is what transforms random fear into informed preparation and transforms potential catastrophe into manageable challenge. Cold iron stands foremost among the materials that historical communities have employed for protection against Samhain entities, and the documentation regarding iron's protective properties appears across multiple centuries and multiple regions with striking consistency. The reason that iron functions as a protective material appears to be rooted in a fundamental incompatibility between iron and the substance or essence of entities that belong to the other world. Historical accounts frequently mention that creatures of the fair folk and other otherworldly beings react to iron with visible distress or with sudden loss of interest in pursuing their intended actions. One particularly detailed account from a blacksmith in County Cork describes his deliberate experimentation with iron as protection, noting that he placed horseshoes and iron nails at specific points around his property and observed that the Phooka, which had previously visited his land with regularity, ceased to appear after the iron was installed. The accounts consistently recommend that iron used for protection should be cold, not freshly forged or warmed, as though temperature plays a role in the material's effectiveness. The practical application of cold iron as a protective measure involves placement of iron objects at thresholds, windows, and other potential points of entry for otherworldly entities. Historical communities employed various forms of iron for this purpose. Horseshoes hung above doorways, iron nails driven into door frames at specific intervals, iron chains placed across windows, and in some cases, entire iron barriers constructed at property boundaries. The Irish Folklore Commission collected accounts documenting specific placement patterns that appeared to have been particularly effective. One family account from County Galway describes an arrangement of 7 iron nails placed in a particular pattern above each door and window, with the arrangement being renewed each year on the eve of Samhain. This family reported remarkably low incidence of direct Samhain-related disturbances across multiple generations, suggesting that the specific placement and maintenance of the iron had genuine protective value. The placement of iron appears to serve as a kind of territorial marker that communicates to otherworldly entities that a space has been deliberately protected and defended. Salt represents the second pillar of traditional Samhain protection, functioning in ways that appear to complement rather than duplicate the protective function of iron. Where iron seems to establish a boundary that otherworldly entities find difficult to cross, salt appears to function as a purifying substance that creates zones where entities lose interest or lose the ability to interact with the physical world. Historical accounts describe the placement of salt in continuous lines around property perimeters, across thresholds, and at specific points around the interior of dwellings. The salt appears to function most effectively when applied fresh on the eve of Samhain, rather than when using salt that has been stored for extended periods, suggesting that the efficacy of the material is connected to its newness or its particular composition at the moment of application. One detailed account from a priest in County Mayo describes the ritual of spreading salt around his church on the eve of Samhain, noting that the salt was applied in a specific pattern that formed a continuous unbroken line. He documents that on multiple Samhain nights, the Sluagh approached his church but never attempted to cross the salt line, seeming instead to circle the salt barrier repeatedly before directing its attention elsewhere. Rowan berries occupy a particular place in traditional Samhain protection, appearing in historical accounts as being particularly effective against specific entities, especially the Phooka and the Sluagh. The protective power of rowan berries appears to be connected to the specific properties of the rowan tree itself, which in Irish and Celtic tradition has long been associated with magical protection and with the ability to see clearly into hidden realms. Historical communities harvested rowan berries in late summer or early autumn and stored them specifically for use as Samhain protection. The berries were dried and sometimes threaded onto cord, creating protective garlands that could be worn or hung in houses. Other accounts describe rowan berries being crushed and mixed with other protective materials, or being scattered on property thresholds. One account, from a woman in County Sligo, describes carrying rowan berries in a small cloth bag when she had to travel on Samhain night, and she reports that while she encountered what she believed to be the Phooka on a crossroads, the creature did not approach her directly, but instead seemed to maintain a deliberate distance, as though the rowan berries created an invisible zone that the creature refused to enter. Crosses constructed from various materials appear frequently in historical accounts as protective objects, and the significance of the cross appears to be connected both to its Christian meaning and to its older significance as a symbol of the intersection between worlds. Historical communities created crosses from rowan wood, from iron, from straw, woven into crossed patterns, and from combinations of materials. These crosses were placed above doorways, positioned at corners of properties, and sometimes worn as personal protective objects. The placement of crosses appears to have been particularly important at the moment the sun touched the horizon on Samhain evening, with families conducting specific rituals to position or renew crosses at this critical moment of boundary crossing. One detailed account from a family in County Clare documents a specific ritual conducted each Samhain involving the placement of 7 rowan wood crosses above windows and 1 cross above the main door, accompanied by specific prayers or recitations. This family's account notes that they maintained this practice across multiple generations with reported success in avoiding direct Samhain disturbances. The combined use of these protections appears to function most effectively when all materials are employed simultaneously and when their placement follows patterns that have been validated through historical use. Communities that applied iron and salt but neglected rowan berries reported less effective protection than communities that employed all 3 materials. Similarly, communities that maintained protective materials but did not renew them regularly or did not maintain them, with deliberate intention, appeared to experience less reliable protection than communities that conducted specific rituals around preparation and placement. This suggests that the protective materials function not entirely through their material properties, but also through the conscious intention and focused awareness of those who prepare and maintain them. The act of deliberately protecting one's home using these specific materials appears to create a kind of resonance with the other world, a communication that the inhabitants are aware of the Samhain threshold and are taking appropriate precautions to maintain the separation between worlds. The maintenance of fire throughout Samhain night represents far more than a practical source of light and warmth in a world that has become fundamentally dangerous. The sacred fire that communities maintain from sunset through dawn on Samhain night serves as a kind of cosmic language, a direct communication with the entities of the other world, stating that this particular space is actively inhabited, actively defended, and actively engaged in the ancient negotiation between worlds. Historical accounts from Irish communities emphasize repeatedly that the fire must be maintained with deliberate intention and careful attention, as though the quality of that attention directly affects the fire's protective potency. The people of rural Ireland understood that fire itself was not merely a chemical reaction, but rather a kind of entity with its own presence and its own role in the cosmic order. To maintain the sacred fire on Samhain night was to declare that humanity understood its place in the relationship between worlds and was willing to invest energy and attention in maintaining the boundaries that kept that relationship stable. The practical requirements for maintaining the sacred Samhain fire are specific and rigorous, and historical documentation suggests that communities who adhered strictly to these requirements experienced notably fewer disturbances than communities that approached the practice more casually. The fire must be built from materials that have been prepared with deliberate intention, typically wood that has been allowed to dry properly, and that has been selected according to specific criteria. Accounts from the Irish Folklore Commission note that certain families preferred particular types of wood. Oak, ash, and hawthorn appear frequently in historical descriptions as being particularly valued for Samhain fires. The fire must be lit at sunset using flame derived from materials that have been preserved specifically for this purpose. Ideally, flame that has been maintained continuously from the previous year's Samhain fire. This practice of maintaining continuous flame from one Samhain to the next creates a direct connection between years, establishing a kind of temporal continuity that extends the fire's protective power beyond the single night of its burning. The positioning of the fire within the dwelling is a matter of considerable importance according to historical accounts, as the location of the flame appears to affect its protective radius and its effectiveness in deterring otherworldly entities. The fire should ideally be positioned in a central location where it can be observed from most areas of the house and where its light can reach all major thresholds and potential entry points. Historical accounts describe communities that position the Samhain fire in hearths, in the center of main rooms, and in some cases, in specific locations that have been selected through generations of accumulated knowledge about optimal placement for protection. One detailed family account from County Tipperary describes the deliberate construction of a special hearth position specifically for the Samhain fire, positioned so that the flames would be visible from every window and door in the main living area. This family's account notes that they maintained this specific fire location across multiple generations and reported consistently low levels of otherworldly disturbance, despite the property's reputation in the surrounding area as being particularly haunted during other seasons of the year. The tending of the fire throughout the night requires that someone remain awake and attentive to the flame's condition continuously from sunset through sunrise. This responsibility typically fell to family elders or to individuals with particular spiritual authority or knowledge within the community. Though in smaller households, family members often rotated responsibility to ensure that no extended period occurred during which the fire lacked direct supervision. The task of tending the fire was not understood as a burden, but rather as a privilege and a necessary participation in the collective effort to maintain the boundary between worlds. Historical accounts describe fire tending as being treated with significant ritual importance, with specific prayers or recitations often being maintained during the hours of fire watching. One account from a widow in County Sligo describes her practice of spending the entire night of Samhain sitting beside her hearth fire, maintaining it with careful attention and reciting specific prayers that her family had maintained for generations. She notes that on the mornings after Samhain, she felt a sense of profound accomplishment and connection to her ancestors, who had performed the same task across multiple generations. The significance of maintaining the fire's visibility and accessibility is emphasized repeatedly in historical documentation. suggesting that the protective function of the flame is directly connected to its ability to illuminate and make present the human inhabitants of the dwelling. The fire must not be allowed to diminish to mere embers, as accounts suggest that a faintly burning fire loses much of its protective efficacy and may actually create conditions that attract otherworldly attention. Similarly, the fire must not be smothered or hidden away in a location where its light does not extend throughout the dwelling, as this appears to create blind spots where protective coverage is diminished. Multiple accounts describe communities that attempted to maintain fires, but positioned them in locations that were not optimally visible or that did not extend their light effectively. These communities reported experiencing disturbances that more carefully maintained fires appeared to prevent. The implication is that the visibility of the flame and the demonstration of active human presence that the flame represents are integral to its protective function. Beyond the central sacred fire, historical communities also maintain specific threshold guards, protective placements of materials and objects at entry points that serve to communicate clearly to otherworldly entities that particular boundaries were marked, acknowledged, and defended. These threshold guards typically incorporated iron and salt, as previously discussed, but also included other elements that varied according to specific family traditions and regional practices. Some families created elaborate threshold constructions involving crossed rowan sticks forming patterns above doorways, iron nails arranged in specific geometric patterns, salt spread in particular configurations, and sometimes bundles of protective herbs hung at entry points. The construction and placement of these threshold guards was often conducted as a ritual involving specific prayers or recitations, family participation, and deliberate intention. One detailed account from County Clare describes a family's Samhain threshold preparation ritual conducted annually on the afternoon of October 31st, with multiple family members participating in the placement of protective materials while reciting specific verses that had been maintained within the family for generations. The combination of the central sacred fire and the carefully maintained threshold guards appears to create a protective environment that functions according to principles that can be understood as establishing clear territorial markers and communicating confident occupation of human space. The presence of the maintained fire signals that the dwelling is actively inhabited and defended. The threshold guards signal that the inhabitants understand the boundary and are prepared to defend it. Together, these protective measures appear to communicate to the entities of Samhain night that this particular location represents human space that is occupied with knowledge and intention, and that penetration of this space would encounter prepared and aware defenders, rather than vulnerable and ignorant occupants. Throughout this examination of Samhain survival, we have discussed the entities that emerge on this night, the protections that function against them, and the specific protocols that allow human survival through hours when the normal rules of reality become negotiable. But underlying all of these practical considerations lies a deeper layer of understanding. The Samhain taboos, the absolutely prohibited actions that communities learned through bitter experience, must never be undertaken on this night, regardless of circumstance or provocation. These taboos are not arbitrary restrictions imposed by religious authorities or cultural tradition, but rather represent accumulated knowledge about what actually happens when the boundaries between worlds become permeable, and when human actions carry consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. To break a Samhain taboo is not merely to take a social risk or to invite minor supernatural inconvenience. It is to potentially alter the fundamental trajectory of your existence and the existence of those connected to you through family or proximity. The most absolute and most universally documented Samhain taboo involves the minat simpershima the consumption of food or drink, that originates from the other world. This taboo appears across multiple centuries of historical documentation, with such consistency that its importance cannot possibly be overstated. The reasoning behind this prohibition is direct and terrifying. To consume food from the other world creates a claim of ownership upon you. The act of eating food from that realm establishes a connection, a debt, a binding obligation that cannot subsequently be severed or negotiated away. Historical accounts describe multiple individuals who disregarded this taboo and who subsequently suffered consequences, ranging from severe illness lasting weeks to permanent alterations in their essential. One particularly detailed account from the archives of the Irish Folklore Commission describes a man who accepted bread offered by a beautiful woman encountered during a Samhain night journey. He consumed the bread and reported that it tasted extraordinarily delicious, like nothing he had ever eaten in his normal life. Within hours of returning home, he began experiencing what he described as a profound sense of being incomplete, an awareness that some essential portion of his being had been left behind with the woman in the darkness. He spent the remainder of his life troubled by this incompleteness, and his family reported that while he continued functioning as a normal member of society, something fundamental had changed in his. The second major taboo involves the acceptance of gifts from strangers encountered on Samhain night, particularly gifts that seem valuable or appealing in any way. This taboo extends beyond mere food and drink to include objects, clothing, or anything material that might be offered as a token or as part of a bargain. Historical accounts describe people who accepted gifts ranging from coins to jewelry to beautiful clothing, and the accounts universally describe consequences involving either the gift becoming worthless or diseased within days, or the person who accepted the gift experiencing gradual deterioration in their health or circumstances. One account from a widow in County Galway describes accepting a ring offered by a beautiful man she encountered on Samhain night, and she reports that the ring felt warm and seemed to pulse with energy when she wore it. Within weeks of wearing the ring, she began experiencing severe arthritis in the hand that wore it, and the condition progressed until she could barely use her hand for normal tasks. She eventually removed the ring and attempted to discard it, but she continued to find it returning to her property repeatedly, and the arthritis never entirely resolved even after she ceased wearing it. A third taboo of extreme importance concerns the act of opening doors or windows after darkness falls on Samhain night, even briefly, even if the reason seems compelling. This taboo is absolute and admits of no exceptions. An open door or window, no matter how briefly it remains open, creates an invitation that the entities of the other world interpret as explicit permission to enter. Historical accounts describe multiple instances where individuals opened doors or windows because they believed there was a logical reason to do so, to retrieve something left outside, to check on an animal, to let in someone who seemed to be calling for entry. In every single documented case, the decision to open the threshold resulted in serious consequences. One account from a farmer in County Mayo describes a man who heard what sounded like one of his sheep calling outside his door on Samhain night. Believing the animal was in distress, he opened his door briefly to check. The brief opening was sufficient for something to enter the house, and while no visible entity was present, the family reported experiencing severe disruptions throughout the remainder of the night, with unexplained sounds and disturbances occurring throughout the dwelling. More troublingly, the farmer developed an inexplicable illness within days and died within weeks, despite having suffered no apparent injury or infection. A fourth critical taboo involves the speaking of true names after darkness falls on Samhain night. This extends not only to your own name, but to the names of family members, neighbours, or anyone with whom you have connection. The reason for this prohibition is grounded in the magical significance of true names. When you speak someone's name on Samhain, you are essentially calling attention to that person, marking them, making them visible to entities that hunt by following such signals. Multiple historical accounts describe people who called out names and experienced immediate consequences. One account describes a man who called to his son by name when he heard sounds outside his house, thinking the boy might have ventured outside. The man's wife restrained him from opening the door, but the fact that he had called the name aloud appeared to be sufficient to attract the attention of something outside. That night, the son fell desperately ill, and though he eventually recovered, he reported vivid nightmares of being hunted and pursued through darkness. The family understood that the man's action of speaking his son's name had created vulnerability that the other world had immediately exploited. A fifth taboo, closely related to the prohibition against opening doors, concerns the act of inviting anyone inside your home after darkness falls on Samhain night, regardless of who they claim to be or what story they tell about why they need shelter. Historical communities understood that anything that appeared to be human on Samhain night might actually be something else wearing human form, and that inviting such a being into your home created obligations and vulnerabilities that could not subsequently be removed. Multiple accounts describe people who gave shelter to travelers on Samhain night, only to discover that their guest behaved strangely or seemed to occupy space in impossible ways, or who discovered the next morning that the guest had somehow exited sealed and locked doors without disturbing anything. One particularly detailed account from County Cork describes a priest who gave shelter to what appeared to be a poor pilgrim on Samhain night. The pilgrim ate enormous quantities of food, but seemed to gain no physical substance from it, and the priest observed that the figure cast no shadow in candlelight. The pilgrim departed in the morning, and the priest subsequently discovered that significant quantities of milk, butter, and other food stores had inexplicably spoiled, despite having been perfectly fresh the night before. The priest understood that by providing shelter to the being, he had incurred a kind of debt that was being paid through the loss of his household stores. Breaking any of these taboos creates immediate vulnerability to entities that have been waiting for precisely such transgression. The entities of Samhain do not randomly hunt or randomly inflict harm. They respond to actions and to choices that humans make. When a taboo is broken, the boundary that has been maintained through careful adherence to protocol becomes compromised. And that compromise creates an opening through which consequences flow directly into human experience. The period from sunset on Samhain to sunrise the following morning represents the single most dangerous window of time in the entire year. Yet within this extended darkness, the level of danger and the specific entities present shift according to patterns that communities learn to recognize and document with precision. Understanding the specific progression of hours and the particular threats that emerge during each phase of the night allows for strategic allocation of protective resources and for deliberate preparation of specific responses to particular entities. Historical communities treated Samhain night not as a single, undifferentiated stretch of darkness, but rather as a sequence of distinct phases, each with its own character and its own particular vulnerabilities and dangers. The Irish Folklore Commission collected detailed accounts describing the progression of Samhain night hour by hour, and these accounts exhibit remarkable consistency across different regions and different time periods, suggesting that the structure of Samhain night follows patterns that are universal rather than localized or variable. The first phase of Samhain night begins precisely at sunset and extends through the first hour following the sun's disappearance below the horizon. This initial phase is characterized by what historical accounts describe as a kind of settling or shifting in the landscape itself, as though the world is adjusting from daylight configuration to a fundamentally different mode of existence. During this hour, the protective measures that have been prepared throughout the day should be verified and ensured to be in place. Doors locked, windows sealed, iron and salt positioned at thresholds, protective fire lit and tended, and all family members gathered within the dwelling. The entities that emerge during this first hour tend to be relatively localized and slow-moving. They have not yet fully crossed from the other world into this one, and therefore move according to rules that are transitional rather than fully otherworldly. Multiple accounts describe the first hour as being characterized by unusual animal behavior. Dogs barking at apparently empty spaces, cats hiding in corners, livestock exhibiting signs of extreme distress. This behavioral response appears to be an accurate indicator that the veil between worlds is indeed beginning to thin. The second and third hours after sunset, typically spanning from around 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night, represent the period when the Phooka becomes most active and most dangerous. These are the hours when the creature is most likely to appear in its various manifestations, on roads, and at crossroads, offering bargains and presenting seemingly appealing opportunities for assistance. Communities strictly enforce protocols during these hours. Anyone who had to be outside during this period was explicitly instructed to remain on established paths, to refuse all offers of assistance or transportation, and to avoid crossroads entirely. The Phooka's activity during these hours appears to be most effective when individuals are exhausted or desperate, which is precisely why the creature's emergence at this particular time of night is so strategically positioned. Multiple accounts describe the Phooka testing boundaries during this phase: appearing and disappearing, approaching and withdrawing, as though assessing the defensive posture of particular properties or particular individuals. Midnight itself represents a critical threshold within the Samhain night experience, and historical accounts consistently describe midnight as the moment when the veil reaches its absolute thinnest point, and when the most powerful and most dangerous entities emerge fully into the human world. The period from midnight to approximately 1 hour after midnight is documented as being the single most dangerous window of the entire Samhain night. During this specific hour, multiple entities may be active simultaneously. The Dullahan is most likely to make its passage during this period. The Sluagh is most active and most aggressive during this hour, and the Banshee's lament, if it occurs, often reaches its greatest intensity during this phase. Historical communities maintained absolute vigilance during this hour, with extra precautions undertaken and with additional attention given to any dying or seriously ill individuals in the household. One detailed account from County Sligo describes a family that made deliberate note of the midnight hour on Samhain night, recording multiple times across different years when they heard the Dullahan's whip, and when the Sluagh's presence seemed most overwhelming, and the family's documentation consistently placed these encounters during the midnight hour. The hours from 1 o'clock until approximately 3 o'clock in the morning represent a period sometimes described as the depth of the night, when darkness is most complete and when human consciousness finds it most difficult to maintain alertness and awareness. During these hours, the psychological pressure created by the presence of otherworldly entities tends to intensify, and accounts describe people experiencing overwhelming impulses toward dangerous actions, opening doors, calling out into darkness, or attempting to venture outside. The protective measures put in place earlier in the evening must be maintained with particular vigilance during these hours, as the combination of darkness and psychological pressure appears to weaken human resistance to the suggestions and impulses created by the presence of Samhain entities. Multiple accounts describe people who successfully resisted urges to open doors or to venture outside during the earlier hours of the night, finding their resistance dramatically weakened during these deep night hours. The recommendation in most historical accounts is for families to remain gathered together in a central location during these hours, maintaining conversation or prayer to prevent any individual from falling into the kind of solitary consciousness that appears to be most vulnerable to otherworldly influence. The hour before dawn, the period from approximately 5 o'clock until the moment the sun appears above the horizon, represents a critical turning point in the Samhain night experience. During this hour, the veil begins to thicken again as the approach of daylight initiates the transition back toward normal reality. Multiple accounts describe the entities of Samhain becoming more desperate or more aggressive during this final hour, as though they understand that their time for hunting and interaction is drawing to an end. The Sluagh is particularly documented as intensifying its efforts during this phase, and accounts describe the creature's vocalizations becoming louder and more insistent as dawn approaches. Simultaneously, however, accounts also describe this hour as being the moment when protective measures appear to gain additional strength, as though the approaching dawn provides additional support and reinforcement to the protections that have been maintained through the night. The recommendation in historical accounts is to maintain absolute vigilance through this final hour, while simultaneously being aware that genuine relief approaches with the first light of dawn. The moment of dawn itself, when the sun rises above the horizon and light begins to return to the landscape, represents a clear boundary where the rules governing Samhain night abruptly cease to apply. The veil thickens again. The entities of Samhain withdraw to the other world. The dangerous hours pass. The families that have successfully maintained their protective measures and adhered to the established protocols find themselves having survived another year, having navigated successfully the most dangerous night in the annual cycle. Historical communities understood dawn not simply as the end of a difficult night, but as a moment of genuine victory, a successful navigation of the boundary between worlds that had required knowledge, preparation, and endurance. Dawn arrives not gradually, but suddenly, as though a threshold has been crossed and the rules that governed the darkness have been abruptly rescinded. The sun rises above the eastern horizon, and the landscape that appeared twisted and wrong in the deep darkness returns to familiar configurations. The creatures that hunted through the night have withdrawn entirely to the other world, constrained by the thickening veil that daylight creates. But what the light of dawn reveals is not a landscape unchanged or a night that has left no trace of its passage. Rather, the morning after Samhain night brings into visibility the marks and signs left behind by otherworldly activity, and learning to read these signs correctly is essential to understanding what occurred during the hours of darkness, and to taking appropriate actions in response. The Irish Folklore Commission collected extensive documentation describing the specific marks and signs that appeared in the aftermath of Samhain nights, and these descriptions provide valuable insight into the entities that had been active during the darkness. The most commonly documented signs appearing after Samhain night involve unusual patterns or disturbances in physical materials. Salt that had been carefully laid at thresholds now appears disturbed or displaced, as though something had attempted to cross it repeatedly. Cold iron placed at windows shows no rust or oxidation, despite being exposed to night air, but exhibits strange heat patterns when touched, as though the metal has been energetically charged. Rowan berries left as protection are sometimes found trampled or partially consumed, and in cases where they have been consumed, the berries appear to have been bitten into rather than simply eaten, suggesting that teeth of a form very different from human teeth had engaged with them One detailed account from a farmer in County Galway describes finding his carefully laid salt lines disrupted in specific patterns that seemed to indicate the path something had taken as it moved around his property's perimeter. The farmer documented these patterns in meticulous detail and noted that the disruption pattern was identical on 3 consecutive Samhain nights, suggesting that the same entity was making the same attempt at entry on each occasion and failing to cross the salt barrier on each occasion. Footprints and other track marks represent another category of signs that frequently appear after Samhain night, though these tracks often exhibit characteristics that make them profoundly disturbing to interpret. Multiple accounts describe finding footprints in soft ground or in ash from the protective fire that appear to be partially human, but with characteristics that deviate from normal human foot structure. Tracks that are too large or too small relative to any human proportions. Footprints that show signs of having been made by feet with an unusual number of toes or with claw-like appendages. Or in some cases, tracks that seem to move in impossible patterns, or that suddenly cease without indication of where the creature creating them departed. One account from a priest in County Cork describes finding tracks after a Samhain night that he documented with drawings, noting that they appeared to be human in basic form, but with the toe structure of a bird or a reptile. The priest recorded that these tracks formed a complete circuit of the church multiple times, and the creature appeared to have tested every external door and window before withdrawing. Strangest aspects of the landscape sometimes become apparent after Samhain night, suggesting that the boundaries between the other world and the human world had temporarily shifted or overlapped. Accounts describe finding portions of the landscape that seem to have been altered or that appeared to belong to a different reality. Stones that were unfamiliar, despite being located on property that had been familiar for generations. Patches of ground where vegetation suddenly flourished or suddenly withered despite no apparent cause. And in rare cases, entire structures or formations that seem to have no explanation for their presence. One account from County Mayo describes a family discovering what appeared to be a stone structure, a kind of circle or marker in the centre of their field after Samhain night, despite the field having been clear and empty the day before. The family initially attempted to remove the stones, but discovered this to be impossible. When they attempted to move one stone, the entire structure rearranged itself back to its original configuration. The family eventually left the structure in place and noticed that it never became more prominent or invasive. It seemed to occupy its space without interfering with agricultural activities, as though it belonged to a different layer of reality that happened to overlap with human space at that particular location. The most psychologically disturbing signs that sometimes appear after Samhain night involve the apparent actions of creatures or entities that had managed to enter homes or structures despite the precautions that had been taken. These signs include food mysteriously spoiled or depleted, objects rearranged or moved to different locations despite sealed and locked doors, and in rare cases, signs indicating that entities had occupied spaces within the dwelling during the night hours. One account from a school teacher in County Sligo describes discovering, after a particularly intense Samhain night, that all the bread in her house had been replaced with bread-like objects that appeared identical to normal bread, but that crumbled to ash when touched. Her family had not heard any disturbances during the night, and the sealed kitchen showed no signs of entry, yet the substitution of the bread seemed absolute and complete. The family understood that something had entered the house despite their protections and had deliberately left this sign, not as a threat exactly, but as a demonstration that entry had been possible and that the creatures had chosen to mark their intrusion in this particular way. The proper response to discovering these signs of otherworldly activity after Samhain is not panic or despair, but rather a kind of ritual acknowledgement and response that communities developed over generations. The first response typically involves careful documentation of what has been found, drawing pictures of footprints, recording the location and extent of disturbed protective materials, photographing or sketching any anomalies in the landscape. This documentation serves multiple purposes. It provides information that might be valuable in adjusting protections for future years. It creates a record that the community can consult when unsimilar disturbances occur. And it serves a psychological function of transforming mysterious and disturbing signs into manageable information that has been carefully examined and understood. The second response involves renewal of protections and preparation for the following year. After dawn, on the morning after Samhain, families traditionally disposed of the protective materials that had been in place, salt, iron, rowan berries, and replaced them with fresh materials in preparation for protecting the home during the coming year. We have journeyed through the hours of Samhain night together, examining the entities that emerge when the veil between worlds grows thin, the protections that communities developed over centuries of accumulated knowledge, and the protocols that allow humans to survive the most dangerous night of the year. We have explored the Dullahan's approach, the Phooka's seductive bargains, the Banshee's lament, and the Sluagh's overwhelming presence. We have discussed the taboos that must be observed, the fires that must be maintained, and the signs that mark the aftermath of this extraordinary night. But before we conclude this examination, we must address a critical question that contemporary listeners often pose. Do these traditions persist in rural Ireland today? Or have they become merely historical curiosities, fascinating to study but no longer relevant to modern experience? The answer, documented in accounts collected as recently as the last decades of the 20th century, is far more complex and far more compelling than a simple yes or no response can capture. The Irish Folklore Commission's work continued well into the 20th century, and the accounts collected during the later phases of this documentation reveal something extraordinary. The traditions surrounding Samhain have not disappeared, but rather have evolved and persisted in forms that are recognizable to anyone familiar with the older accounts, yet adapted to modern circumstances. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, rural communities in Western Ireland still maintained many of the protective practices documented centuries earlier. Families still prepared protections involving iron and salt. Fires were still maintained throughout Samhain night, though sometimes accompanied by electric lighting rather than relying entirely on open flame. The taboos surrounding Samhain night were still explained to children, still respected by adults, and still enforced within communities through social pressure and through acknowledged understanding of consequences. The entities themselves may have become less frequently discussed in public, relegated to private family knowledge and to conversations conducted in Irish rather than English, but they remained very much part of the living reality of communities that maintained connection to older ways of understanding the world. What makes these modern accounts particularly significant is that they demonstrate that the Samhain traditions are not merely historical artifacts preserved through nostalgic attachment, but rather a kind of living framework that continues to function in communities where it is actively maintained. When communities cease to maintain the protective practices and cease to teach the taboos to younger generations, documented accounts suggest that disturbances increase. Conversely, when communities consciously choose to maintain these traditions despite modern skepticism and modern pressure to dismiss them as superstition, the protective framework appears to remain effective. One particularly detailed account from the 1980s describes a family in County Galway that deliberately maintained traditional Samhain practices while their neighbours increasingly abandoned them. The family that maintained the traditions reported a notably lower frequency of disturbances on Samhain nights compared to neighboring families. And when unusual events did occur in the community on Samhain, they seemed most frequently to affect families that had discontinued the protective practices. The wisdom encoded in Samhain traditions extends far beyond simple supernatural protection into deeper territories of human psychology, community cohesion, and adaptive response to periods of genuine danger or transition. The practices that communities developed over centuries represented sophisticated understanding of how to maintain psychological resilience during periods of extended stress and darkness. The requirement to remain indoors, to maintain fire, to gather family members together, and to focus collective attention on protective measures creates the conditions for emotional support and community reinforcement during times that are genuinely challenging for human psychology. The taboos against opening doors, against speaking names, and against accepting offerings from strangers represent internalized risk management strategies that encourage caution and deliberate decision-making during periods when danger is genuine and when stakes are genuinely high. The marking of Samhain as a distinctive night, separate from ordinary time and governed by different rules, represents a sophisticated understanding of how to compartmentalize danger and to invest community energy into managing specific threats during specific windows of vulnerability. The deeper significance of Samhain traditions lies in their representation of humanity's continuing relationship with forces and realities that we do not fully understand. The modern world often encourages dismissal of such traditions as primitive superstition, as evidence of ignorance that has been superseded by scientific understanding. Yet the traditions persist, and they continue to function, which suggests that there is something of genuine value being maintained across the centuries, whether the entities described, the Dullahan, the Phooka, the Banshee, the Sluagh, represent actual beings that emerge on specific nights, or whether they represent psychological projections of deeply rooted human fears, or whether they represent something far more complex that transcends simple categorization, remains debatable. What seems less debatable is that the traditions represent a coherent framework for understanding certain human experiences, for managing certain psychological states, and for maintaining community identity and cohesion across generations. The practice of Samhain protection represents something far more profound than simple defense against supernatural entities. It represents an acknowledgement that there are aspects of reality that we do not fully control or fully understand, that there are boundaries between different states of existence that deserve respect and careful navigation, and that human survival and flourishing depends partly on maintaining awareness of these boundaries and maintaining the disciplines and protections that allow us to cross them safely. In this sense, the traditions maintain relevance not because the specific entities are necessarily real in any literal sense, but because they encode wisdom about how to live in a world that is far more complex and far more mysterious than modern rationality often acknowledges. The Samhain night stands as a marker in the calendar, a moment when communities deliberately acknowledge the thinness of certain boundaries and consciously invest energy in maintaining separation and protection. As you move forward from this examination of Samhain traditions, whether you approach these practices as fascinating historical study, as genuine survival information, or as psychological and spiritual frameworks for managing the transitions in your own life, you now possess knowledge that has been maintained across centuries by communities that considered it essential to survival and flourishing. If you found value in this exploration of living traditions and the wisdom encoded within them, I encourage you to subscribe to Echoes of the Old World, where we continue to examine the real histories, the genuine traditions, and the profound wisdom that cultures around the world have maintained across centuries. Your subscription helps us continue to bring these stories of cultural memory and ancestral knowledge to audiences who recognize that understanding our past is essential to navigating our present and shaping our future. The veil between worlds remains thin at certain moments and in certain places. May you navigate such moments with awareness, with preparation, and with the wisdom of those who have come before.